Well, hey now, how's it going, everyone? So I'm one of those people that likes to start with I'm a big proponent of the concept of start with why. So why am I here? So I'm here to I'm here, A, to tell you some interesting stories. At least I think they're interesting. And I'm also here to give you a little bit of food for thought around this industrial control system cybersecurity puzzle that we're all dealing with. And so in order to begin this, I like to prime the pump a little bit. And by doing so, I like to use a little thing that I stole from a class I took at MIT a few years ago. It's called the dilemma of the cube. So if you were to take a cube, now this is going to take a little bit of imagination here, guys, so follow me here. Imagine a cube. Now imagine you have a peephole in the side and in the top. If you were to look solely through peephole A, well, you'd be pretty certain there was a triangle inside the box. If you were only given the option to look through peephole B, well, you'd be pretty certain there's only a circle in the box. However, it's not until you get the opportunity to look through peephole A and peephole B, taking both sides of that into consideration, that you're actually able to see what's in the box. And in this particular instance, there's a cone in the box. So it all goes back to, I fancy myself a little bit of a storyteller, right? So you're going to have to endure me for the next few minutes here as I go through some of my favorite stories. But I feel that these stories have value. You know, Otto von Bismarck once famously said, he said, "Only fools learn from experience. I myself prefer to learn from the experience of others." And so I think stories are a good way to translate that and communicate those experiences. And so I'm going to get right into it. Back in the 1700s, we're going way back here. Back in the 1700s in Europe, they were facing quite the crisis. Smallpox was sweeping across the continent, and it was killing people en masse. So more than 35% of the people that contracted smallpox found themselves in a bad spot. They died, they perished. Those that survived it were generally horribly disfigured. As you can imagine, the scientists, doctors, and researchers at the time decided something needed to be done about this. And so they started to focus their question on what they thought was the most logical question to ask. And that's, why are people getting smallpox? Well, that led to a lot of dead ends, no pun intended. It wasn't until a doctor by the name of Dr. Edward Jenner came along and posed a different question, a different line of thinking that would change the trajectory of smallpox research forever and lead to its virtual eradication. He asked, why aren't the milkmaids dying of smallpox? So you got to take a second here and appreciate the kind of mind that comes up with this, right? So Dr. Jenner is sitting there, all the horrors of smallpox around him, and yet he's able to sit there and think, hey, why aren't the milkmaids suffering too? I bet he was a real blast at parties, right? But the whole thing with Jenner was he took a different approach. So he started a different line of thinking where he started to question, instead of why are people getting smallpox, he started to question why are milkmaids not getting smallpox? And that led him down a track to eventually determine what the reason was. And I know you're dying to hear what the reason was. So the reason milkmaids don't contract smallpox is by the very nature of their work. You see, milkmaids are constantly exposed to cowpox. And so cowpox gives the same immunity as smallpox without the deadly consequences of dying of smallpox. So it was this line of questioning that led him to where he needed to be. And so my question to you is, what do you think is the fundamental question we're facing today in the industrial control system cybersecurity space? Now, having worked at some of the largest companies in the world, I know that they tend to think that the fundamental question to answer is, how do we keep the bad guys out? But in reality, is that truly the case? You're never actually going to keep the bad guys out, at least not forever. In every control system, no matter how air-gapped it is, somewhere, somehow, someone has touched it and it wasn't you. And so my question becomes, what is that fundamental question? Now, I'm going to go off-road here for a second, so stand by, keep that question in mind while I take you for a little journey here. If I were to ask you, what's the opposite of fragility, right? And I'm asking you why. I'm talking about fragility for a number of reasons, but primarily because in my personal experience, nothing on Earth, very few things on Earth are as fragile as the process control network. And so on the Mike Thompson scale of fragility, I placed a process control network somewhere between a soap bubble and a butterfly's wings. And so my question becomes, what can we do to change that? And so let's talk a little bit about fragility and the essence of fragility. So fragility is something that's fragile is something that when confronted with stress, it fractures or deforms. So what would you say the opposite of something that's fragile is? Well, many people would say something that's strong, resilient, tough. These are things that come to people's minds. But that's not exactly the case. You see, something that's strong, resilient, tough, it's not as susceptible to stress, but it's not the opposite of what fragile is. It wasn't until the author Nassim Taleb came along and coined the term anti-fragility that we truly got something representative of the opposite of fragility. So anti-fragility is a kind of interesting concept. So let's unpack that one real quick. Anti-fragility, so think about this. We're surrounded by anti-fragile systems, both around us and within us. Your bones, for example, are an anti-fragile system. When stress is applied to your bones, they calcify and strengthen at that point of stress. This is called Wolff's Law for anybody that wants to geek out and look it up on Wikipedia. There are countless other ones. Let's go a little bit higher into the higher concept of fragility. Think about this mental model for a moment. Everyone's familiar with the delicateness of wine glasses. If you were going to ship a box of wine glasses through the mail, they would stamp on there very gently, fragile, handle with care, right? Well, if you were shipping anti-fragile wine glasses, they would instead say anti-fragile, please drop and kick. So that's kind of the thing I'm getting at here. So when we talk about the fragility of the process control network, and I can tell by the laughter in the audience when I brought this up that this is something we all seem to be in agreement with, that it's ridiculously fragile. The idea of making an anti-fragile system, perhaps that's the line of questioning we should be looking towards. Rather than being stuck in the same mindset that the doctors that kept asking, why are people getting smallpox, found themselves in, we should be looking for another question, and maybe that question is in regards to the fragility. So, like I said, I have a bunch of these stories. They're a lot better after a couple mojitos, so if you see me after this, find me and I'll go into some more details around this. But this is another one of my actual favorite stories to tell here. And so this is, it goes back to World War II. So back in World War II, there was a mathematician, a young man by the name of Abraham Wald. Now, Abraham Wald is assigned to a group called the SRG, the Statistical Research Group. Now, the SRG was dedicated to the war efforts. Basically, it's mathematicians fighting the war. They weaponized math. Is there anything cooler sounding than that, right? So the SRG did a bunch of very interesting things. They have quite it's not Indiana Jones caliber interesting, but interesting as far as mathematicians go. So if you ever look them up, you can see some of the things that this group did for the war effort. One of which was they took aircraft machine gunners. Each aircraft machine gunner had his own recipe as to how he would load the machine gun. So each would sit down and say, okay, I'm going to put one tracer round, one armor piercer, one standard round. And then the next aircraft gunner, he says, no, my recipe is clearly better. How we want to do this is we want to put 5 standard rounds, we'll waste them, we'll use a tracer round to find out where it's going, and then we'll hit them with the armor piercer. So each one of them had their own idea around how to do this better than the next guy. But as it turns out, they were all wrong. So they had the SRG come in and do an analysis of this, and they found that the tracer rounds were actually detracting from the accuracy of firing. In fact, what turned out to be the optimal solution for shooting down enemy aircraft was just load the machine gun with all armor piercers and get after it. And so this was one, it's kind of interesting because to us it seems pretty straightforward, right? But back in the day when you're sitting there, you think, man, I got this. This is how it needs to be. So this is the caliber of genius within the SRG. But the sharpest among the sharps was young Abraham Wald. And this is what led them to tap him for the most perplexing problem that they had. You see, the Allied forces were trying to fly sorties over enemy-occupied territory. And the enemy had this uncanny thing that they would do where they would shoot down our bombers. Well, the Allied forces found that unacceptable, and so they determined that there needs to be a way to better armor these aircraft. Now, there's kind of a diminishing return between the amount of armor you can place on the aircraft and then how far and fast it can fly. And so the idea became apparent that we need to be a little bit more selective on where we place our armor, hence that title. So they painstakingly pinpointed all the bullet holes and aircraft battle damage on all the planes returning from their sorties. And they plotted it on a huge distribution plot to see where the concentration of the enemy fire was hitting these planes. And they took this and they came to the conclusion that the fuselage was being struck the most. Now, it kind of makes sense, right? The fuselage is a large surface area. The enemy aircraft gunners were likely aiming at center mass, so it made sense that a lot of the bullets and shrapnel hit the fuselage. And so these guys were ecstatic. They were like, man, we're just going to armor the fuselage and we're going to get after it. Well, when you have all that brain power laying around, every once in a while it's cool to use it. And so the Allied generals took this information and they walked down the hall to the SRG. And they tapped young Abraham Wald and they said, hey man, take a look at this and tell us what you think. This is all the information we have, and we believe that the best place to put our additional armor is on the fuselage here. We just want you to confirm how awesome we are. So what happens next is kind of the stuff of legend. Young Abraham Wald looks over the documentation, turns to the generals, he says, forget about armoring the fuselage. He's like, put the armor on the engines and the cockpit. Well, the generals were floored. They're like, Wald, are you looking at what we're looking at? It's obvious where the planes are being struck. To which Wald replied, yeah, it's obvious to where the planes are being struck on the planes that made it back. The ones that got shot down were hit in the cockpit and the engines. Put the armor on the cockpit and the engines if you want more to come back. So they did. Now, the interesting thing about that is that, this has a dual kind of lesson here. So one thing that we learned is it goes back to asking the right question again, right? So the Allied generals, they weren't asking the right question. They wanted to know, where do we put the armor on the planes that are coming back to make them stronger? That's the question that they answered. When in reality, they wanted to know, where should we put the armor on the planes that did not make it back? And so not only does this kind of touch on the whole concept of ask the right question, but it also goes into another very interesting topic that I know we all hold near and dear, and that's the iteration between IT and OT and the dynamics between these teams, right? And so I always find it very interesting to talk about this, and I think this is a good story to illustrate that, because it took Wald and the generals working together to truly defend these airplanes, just like it takes IT and OT together to truly defend the ICS. And it's not that I'm ever saying one team is more important than the other. Never. That's not the idea. What I am saying is it's different approaches, and there's different comparative strengths and weaknesses. So I'm a control systems engineer, and I'm also a certified functional safety engineer. And so I'm really good at eliminating random failures. I am not, however, that gifted when it comes to addressing adversarial attacks, and so by intelligent opponents, right? It's not my job to create like a DCS that tricks the operator, so I don't get a lot of practice or experience in that realm. But I do realize it takes both to do this, and wouldn't you know it, I got a little bit of a game that I seen a while back that I always like to illustrate this, and it's kind of the difference between the mindsets. So Microsoft actually used this back in the day to test for logical thinking in their interview process for young engineers coming in. It's a little game, and it goes something like this. I'm going to guess a number, or I'm going to pick a number between 1 and 100, and then you're going to guess. You don't have to call out anything. I'm going to answer for you. That makes it way easier. Every time you guess, you get 5 guesses overall, and each time I'm going to tell you higher or lower. And then based on that, if you can get to the number that I selected, you win. Now, just to let you know, if I gave you 7 guesses, it's almost mathematically impossible that you won't get it. So there's a little bit of give here. So if I were to start and say, okay, I'm ready, I have my number in my head. As a logical young engineer, most likely you would say your first guess would be 50. You want to divide and conquer. And that's a great logical methodology to employ. Bisect the integers. And so I would say, sorry, lower. And then your next guess would likely be 25. Also, great strategy. You guys are on your way to a job at Microsoft, I can tell. And so from that, you would then say, I would say, no, sorry, it's higher than 25. At which time you would then say, okay, 37. Again, using that same strategy. No, sorry, higher than 37. And then the person would almost always say 42, applying that same rigorous, methodical engineering approach. And then at 42, now you're in a little bit of deep kimchi, as we say in the military, because you have a lot of numbers to guess from and not a whole lot of opportunity to pinpoint it. And so with this being your final guess, almost everyone, and I've done this to hundreds of people, almost everybody says 49. Survey says, What the number I picked is 47. Now, I picked 47 for a reason. I didn't randomly pick a number. I picked a number that I knew that if you employed this very logical, methodical process, it would be the one furthest away from your last guess. And so that's the difference between random failure and adversarial intent. And so that's why it takes different actors and different people in different roles to truly defend the ICS system. Well, I got one more story for you here. So again, this is another World War II story, and World War II is chock full of very interesting learning opportunities. So the last one deals with France after World War I. So after World War I, France said, never again. We're going to do something to deter German aggression. And so the French got together and they built a fabulous engineering marvel known as the Maginot Line. Now, the Maginot Line was practically impervious to firepower. It had places for people to sleep. It was state-of-the-art at that time. It was an amazing engineering feat, and it was designed to, if an opponent attacked, it would stall them long enough for the French to mount a potent counteroffensive. It was an incredible obstacle. In fact, it was so incredible that it worked too good. So the Germans, when they decided to be aggressive again, went around the Maginot Line, except where they decided to go through it. So in the Ardennes forest, it was not as armored, it was not as manned, because the French at the time thought, hey, nobody's going to go through this forest. It's too densely populated with trees and everything. It would take forever. Little did they know, Germany decided that they were going to reformulate their attack methodology, and they started to employ the concept of blitzkrieg. And so the French were still fighting the previous war. So ultimately, what it comes down to is my last question to you is, what are you doing to ensure that you're not fighting the last war in your industrial control system cybersecurity security attempts? And with that, I'm out of here. Thank you, guys.